Welcome back to the Resilient Responder, a podcast dedicated to the men and women of our first responder and military communities. Here we talk about the job, mental wellness and resiliency, coaching, family, and living our best lives. Now, once again, here is your host, Keith Hanks.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Resilient Responder podcast. Again, I am your host, Keith Hanks, and this podcast is always dedicated to the mental wellness and resiliency of the men and women in the first responder and military world. It's always interesting when I get the ability to bring guests onto the show, who we end up getting on. And like I said in the beginning, when we put this whole thing together, it wasn't always going to be just the first responders, right? We wanted to open this up and open people's minds to the other end of this when it comes to the mental wellness, and that would be the clinicians and the other resources that are out there. And today's guest is just that. My guest today is Katy Luallen. She's from California. She is a practicing therapist, trainer, and an advocate, has been for a long time. And she began working with first responders and veterans very early on in her career. She's been a clinician with the critical incident stress management team out of Butte County for over 20 years, where she's the clinical co-director. She trains both fire and law enforcement agencies and peer support teams as well. In her private therapy practice, she's facilitated a first responder-based support group as well. So with that, I'll let Katy kind of take over and give me and our guests a little bit more of her background and what she does. Katy, thanks for coming on today.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be chatting with you about this. Let's see. So more about me. I kind of fell into working with first responders. I hung out with a bunch of firefighters when I was in graduate school. So that was my sort of first introduction to the culture. And then was asked to be on the CISM team in 2001 maybe. And then really had an amazing experience after 9/11 when our team was asked to come and debrief. NYPD was debriefing their entire department. And we were asked to, CSF asked all different CISM teams across the United States, and I think actually outside the United States as well, to send teams if they wanted to. And I just happened to be able to go, which was amazing. I went with 3 police officers from Butte County. And we spent 8 days debriefing NYPD officers and going around. It was April. While I was there, they found a body, which was amazing, an amazing experience. We watched from kind of a viewing platform as they lined the runway with all the EMS and then brought the body out. It was an incredible experience. So that was kind of like, oh, these are my people, and this is kind of really where I want to focus. And then since then, I've kind of off and on had lots of nurses, doctors, paramedics, EMTs, fire and law enforcement, and dispatchers also. So yeah, I see a lot of people every week. And I also have another therapist that works for me who sees 38 people a week also. So
nice. It's a pretty interesting crowd of people that you've chosen to hang around and provide counseling and therapy to. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So one of the things I always like to do is break down the misnomers a lot with a lot of these resources, and I think I like to tell people I've been around for a while. My family was in this field since the late 1800s, so I kind of grew up around it, and the mindset has always been that, if you get therapy, if you go see a quote unquote shrink, you're weak. And we're just starting, and I know you'll understand this in the last 3 to 5 years, to break that down, and it's all part of the stigma. In your time doing this, what have you seen from your perspective when it comes to the transition of more and more, specifically, I guess, men, but even women, first responders coming and talking to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I see such a change when we do debriefings, and that is kind of a good measure because it's a large group of people, sometimes men and women, and also different agencies, right? So in a debriefing, you'll have law enforcement, fire, dispatch, EMS. And I remember the first debriefing I did was a huge double homicide, officer involved shooting. 2 officers were killed. And I remember I was sitting in the middle of the SWAT team, and they were not happy to be there. And, arms crossed, sitting back in their chairs, mumbling under their breath. And understandable, right? They
Mm-hmm.
didn't, I think maybe someone told them they had to be there, which isn't how we like to do CISM, but sometimes
Right.
that happens. And fast forward to starting probably 5 or 6 years ago, where there's none of that. There is none of that at debriefings, especially. Part of it is that we're pretty familiar. I'm pretty familiar in the EMS scene these days. And so they know who I am. I used to be like the only one, that was
Right.
not in EMS. So that's part of it. But I think the other part is that, especially in our county, there have been a lot of people my age, I'm 48, and lower, who are pretty educated about it.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're the captains, and they're becoming the battalion chiefs, and they're becoming the lieutenants, and they're becoming the sergeants. And they are really, some of them are really encouraging it. And so, we have captains that will come into a debriefing in the beginning and say to their teams, hey, we're so glad you guys are here. This is super helpful. I'm in therapy myself, and then they'll leave because they weren't part of the incident. But that holds huge weight
Right.
in breaking down that stigma. We had a huge fire, the Camp Fire, which burned down an entire town 7 miles from here,
Right.
and other towns a little away. And I did a lot of station visits about 4 days later, and I traveled around with a battalion chief who actually was my client. It just happened that way because we were both working at the incident command base. And we walked into the first station, and he said, he introduced himself, and then he said, this is Katy, she's a therapist. She's actually my therapist. And you could just see everyone at the station was like,
Wow.
yeah, it was so powerful. So I have seen a huge change, and I like to remind people of that. There are still some of the old school suck it up. But I just kind of like to pretend they're not there.
It's weird, and it's funny that you bring up the age thing. So I talk about this all the time with people, and I
Yeah.
just had this conversation with one of our last guests. The age thing is clutch here. So I find now I'm 44, and obviously, like I said, I got on the job back in the mid-90s. I have found with like the national speaking, the advocate sort of scene, that there's like this bracket, and that bracket is from around 36 to 52 with at least men. And that's huge because those are your senior members, those are your veterans, those are the people who are being looked up to. And if those people in that age group are willing to be vulnerable and transparent when it comes to mental health and their therapy or the resources they use, that's going to trickle down to the folks coming in the door or going through the academy. And it's funny that you say that, because it's that bracket, and it's great. It's great to hear that, because those are the people that I know when I got on. Those are the people I was looking up to.
Right. And it was very different, I'm assuming.
It was a little bit. And going back to what you said about the schism with the arms crossed, I remember my first one in 97 after a fatal fire, and the details of the fire are not really relevant besides the fact that it was a murder suicide. And the schism was literally walked in, and it was like 15 of us, all men, and then the guy looked at the crowd and was like, hey, you guys want to share your feelings? And no one did, and literally looked at all of us and was like, coffee and donuts in the back. And that was it. That was my first schism interaction at 18 years old. And things have changed, as you know.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. Another place that I think I see a huge difference is when I talk to other therapists or read things about working with first responders. Sometimes there's this message of, oh, you have to be so careful. Like, you need to have an entrance door and a door that people can go out of because of all this stuff. And I find that the opposite is true, that I sometimes say more therapy happens in my waiting room than it does in my room. Because people will be waiting to come in and going out, and you can see it. They're like, oh, you're here too. And there's this comfort in like, okay, we're in the same boat. They're all in the same boat. They all know it,
Yeah.
right? It's just whether or not they're willing to deal with it. So that's the other part I like to talk to people about, that when there are supervisors that are negative, or our huge fire, which was in a string of fires that people responded to, but the one that was close by was in 2018. And sometimes, you'll hear the older people saying, "Oh, when are you going to get over it? That was 4 years ago." And,
Hmm.
um, I like to say, well, you don't ever get over it. You move through it.
Heal.
Yeah, I think it's important to see that the people that don't want to deal with it, or who say, when are you going to get over it, are fearful of dealing with their own shit.
Yeah.
Because once they say, "Oh, Keith, I see that you're hurting," now they're opening this gate for, now I have to look at my own hurt. And that's pretty scary for people.
Self-reflection, it can be a terrifying thing when you're not ready for it. And I know I was. It was very terrifying for me until I owned it and started, taking care of my
Yeah.
own shit.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's hard. And I just like to have grace with those people and say, well, when they're ready, or when when the shit hits the fan and they can't get out of bed, or they can't get on the engine, or they can't put their pants on, they'll end up dealing with it also, you know?
It's very true. And this is a great segue to a part I like to talk about a lot with people, especially first responders, and that is how much that the job itself actually triggers personal stuff with first responders.
Mhm.
And as a man, I know that I always just was like, oh, no, the job is really hard. It's all these dead people I'm seeing, it's all these bad calls, when in
Right.
actuality that was just triggering stuff from my personal life. Have you I'm sure you have. I'm not even going to ask if you have. From your perspective, what has that been like when you've worked through with different clients to hear them sort of make that transition to?
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that I think of and I say, especially with men, is you have two strikes. One is you're a man in America.
Mm,
So from the time you were out of the womb, you've been taught not to recognize, deal with, name, your feelings. And then you've gone into a job where you learned that you can't get through this if you feel anything. So you better shut it down and do your job. And
bingo.
so then here you are, and that works for a while, right? It works in the beginning. It's exciting. There's a lot of adrenaline. Often people are single, they get off their 4 days or 3 days and they're home, and they go skiing and drink and whatever, right? And they come back to work. Well, I find it kind of stops working once there's a significant other or children,
Mm,
right? Where you can't just come home and totally check out, how healthy and unhealthy ways, right? Now there are demands at home also. And you've also been taught to compartmentalize. So you're coming home and only sharing half of yourself, if that, because you've been told leave work at work, which is impossible, by the
yeah.
way.
Right.
Right. So it's super fucked up. And people are like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm like, well, I know what's wrong with you. You're not being allowed to be who you are. I've had clients come in and just sit and cry for the first 5, 6 sessions. And they'll say, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's, and I'm like, I do. You have seen a lot of sad, scary, upsetting shit. And you've not allowed your body to let go of it in any way. And here you are. This is healthy. So often I see that what I'm helping people work on is what's going on in your body, and what are those, how do you name that, right?
Mm,
And then also, how long have helping them recognize what you're saying, how long has it been that you've not been able to recognize your feelings?
right.
Most of us that work in these helping fields have childhood trauma of our own,
Hmm.
which is why we feel comfortable doing it. Bessel van der Kolk, who's amazing, who wrote Body Keeps the Score. I was at a conference and he showed a picture of the Twin Towers burning, and it was from Brooklyn on the Brooklyn Bridge, and all the people were coming out towards Brooklyn.
Mhm.
And he said, this is what normal people do. Normal people leave when something like this happens.
Right.
But fucked up people go to
Yep.
that happening, right? And so recognizing what is it about our history that helped us become, feel safer or comfortable at least in chaos.
Mm.
Um, and that can be hard to face. It can be hard to see that, especially if you've learned your entire life to not look at that and to not express it and to not name it and to not share it for sure.
Yeah.
So
It's so one of the things I always say to people when it comes to that is that, you know, the running towards danger thing where normal people, smart people, if you will,
mhm.
go the other way.
Yeah.
I always tell people in regards to what I went through with my own childhood trauma, that at that point when I was on the job, there was nothing more scarier, more terrifying than what I had already been through. So therefore, maybe in a way, there's almost like a death wish part there where you're not
Mhm.
afraid of it. And what's it going to
Right.
do? It's going to kill you. Everything's going to be over. So, it's always funny when someone, well, not funny, it's actually terribly sad, but it's always interesting when someone, especially from a
Mhm.
clinical point, brings up that point of view that, a lot of these first responders, especially the men, have had childhood trauma. And the numbers, and I'm sure you're aware of this, the numbers are very high. I was part of a
Yeah.
research project where they did a surveyed 100 men, male firefighters, and 75% of them, who these were all men who either were diagnosed with PTSD or had symptoms of, 75%
Mhm.
of them had childhood trauma.
Oh yeah. Yeah, undoubtedly. I probably 85%,
Right.
75% know about it or were able to express it. Yeah, it's huge. And on the flip side, it's also an amazing gift
Hmm.
to be able to have the resiliency to go through what people have gone through as children, young adults, and still be able to function, in this capacity. And people often say, I'm so afraid of learning about my feelings. What if I'm on a incident and I'm overwhelmed with feelings because now I know how to feel my feelings. Am I going to be able to do my job? And
Mm.
I always say yes, absolutely, because of all your training and also your fight or flight, you're going to do the right thing. And the real danger is if you haven't dealt with your shit
Mm.
and it comes up for the first time on an incident and you freeze, that's the danger.
Right.
Right now, we're working on letting it out, recognizing it, knowing what to do with it when it comes. And there's less danger now of it getting in the way of you performing your job. But I get it. And people will say to me, like, ugh, I wish I had never started this process because it's so painful.
Yeah.
And I'll remind them when they came in, I'll remind them when you came in, you were drinking from the moment you got off of work until the moment you went back. You were getting high the entire time as well. You
Hmm.
had zero relationship with your wife. You didn't know your kids. You didn't have friends. So it wasn't great, which is why you probably decided to come in. But yes, there are parts of it that are easier when you're not aware of your feelings for sure.
And I think that's part of what leads to the biggest part of the stigma is that people think that if you start dealing with your feelings, all of a sudden you're not going to be a tough guy or tough girl anymore, and you're not going to be able to do the job anymore. And it's like, honestly, at this juncture, at least in my life and other people I know who have dealt with their feelings, I'm
Uh,
a stronger person. I'm
oh, absolutely.
I'm more reliable. I'm stronger.
Yeah.
I love myself more, which means I'm able to do things
Mhm.
better and more wholeheartedly. It actually makes you stronger. And I think that's a lot of like what we do here, what you're doing out in California, what other people are doing when it comes to advocating is letting people know that this isn't about taking the toughness out of the job. This isn't about not being part of that 1.5% that can do the job. This is about being able to do it better and heal from it and be resilient.
Yes. Yeah, I love that you said wholeheartedly because the definition of courage is to show up with your whole heart,
Right.
all of it. right? The fear, the humiliation, the sadness, the excitement, the joy, the glory, all of it. And I've had like a police officer that I can think of who was at a scene. He was there by himself. It was taking a long time for people to come. And, he was really upset because he said, all I could do was hold the victim's head and just be there with them. And he said, and it was so upsetting. And I had tears in my eyes. And I said, that is so beautiful, right?
Yes.
I mean, this guy's dying and you're sad, which is so appropriate.
Yep.
So much more appropriate than sitting there like, fuck this, like, yes, it's sad. You're holding someone's head while they die. And what a beautiful gift to them that they weren't alone, and that the person that was holding their head was caring and loving and vulnerable in their last moments,
They were
but it
human.
does take a lot of, yes, it takes a lot of normalizing that to help people. I'll say, you've been learning for 44 years not to show your feelings, and that feelings are bad and they're a weakness. So it's going to take a while to unlearn it, but it happens rather quickly, I find, once people are in the situation where they can be open and vulnerable.
Yeah, once those dominoes start falling in a positive way, it does happen quickly, and you quickly learn. You don't necessarily change, but you quickly learn what you need to do to continue to change, and especially when it comes to, like you said, feeling again, and feeling maybe for the first time, and having that full spectrum of emotions instead of just anger and confusion and anxiety. You actually have a full spectrum. You're able to be happy, you're able to be sad, you're able to be scared, because it's okay to be scared. Even as a man, I get scared.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
you have to own that.
Yeah. 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 And I think that people do, once they're more comfortable with it, once they've been doing it for a while, they know that, I think it's just
Yeah.
right in the beginning where it's like, oh shit. And I will always ask people, how does your body feel?
Mm,
Like lower than your throat, right? Because
yeah.
so many men, they can tell me they think what they're thinking, but I'll say, no, like, what do you feel in your throat? What do you feel in your chest? What do you
Mm.
feel in your heart? What do you feel in your belly? What do you feel in your knees? And it takes a long time for people to kind of have that loop opened. But they get so much more information about what's going on once they do, so it's super important.
It's huge. It's huge. And this is a for men, and we're gonna in 2 seconds, we're actually gonna talk about the my view on how females have to deal with this,
Ugh.
especially in the first responder world. But I just want to say that, as men, we have for generations been taught to just bury it. And
Mhm.
it has, what in my mind has led to so many problems, especially on
Yeah.
domestic level, with the
Oh
relationships,
yeah.
that we're not facing who our emotions that everyone else is allowed to face. And then you take and you mix in there a tough culture like the military and the first responder world, where it's like, no, you have to be tough all the time, you have to be a cyborg. And they teach you to keep those dials up, but they don't teach you how to bring them back down to normal limits, when you're not operating on a high stress incident. And that's where the problem really is that you don't go back to being human.
Right. Yeah. Brene Brown, who's so great, her research about feelings is so amazing. And she says you can't selectively shut down feelings. So when you shut down fear and sadness and humiliation and vulnerability, you also shut down joy and happiness and care and all those other emotions. And I agree with you. I think it's why we have such a huge drug and alcohol problem also with first responders and veterans, because that is a reliable way to shut down
Mhm.
feelings, right? It becomes a very um, necessary feeling way of being okay when all that stuff starts to come up, and someone doesn't know what to do with it.
Yeah, no, it's a big thing. Bad coping skills are, have been for at least a while, a way of life in the first responder world, and
Uh,
this is a good spot. We're gonna take a quick break, folks. We're gonna hear from our sponsor, First Responder Coaching, real quick, and we're gonna come back and get right back into this conversation.
Coaching is here now for all first responders and their families. When it comes to the job and the stresses that come with it, we at First Responder Coaching know exactly how it can affect every aspect of your life and the lives of those around you. That's because we are first responders and their families. First responders are well versed in reacting to a situation. It is literally what we do as firefighters, law enforcement, dispatch, and EMS personnel. When trauma enters our lives, we react to it by tucking it down away somewhere in our minds. But we carry it with us and it never really goes away. We need to stop carrying trauma into every aspect of our personal and professional lives. It's time to start having proactive, powerful conversations right now to gain a better balance in the responder's whole life. This is true for their families, especially the spouses. Take that first step in making some of the most important improvements in your life. Visit www.1strespondercoaching.org now to make an appointment to chat with FRC. A coach will reach out, and before you know it, you'll be on your way to living a proactively fit lifestyle.
All right, so here with Katy Luallen, we are having an amazing conversation from a clinician's point of view. She works with first responders out in the West Coast and across the country. And we're really getting into this conversation to give you guys some perspective from a therapist's point of view on this. And where we left off, it kind of transitions into a part that I hold very near and dear to me, and that's identity and purpose. And I've discovered, and I didn't realize this for years, right? It was always there, but I didn't realize that the job was my identity up until not many years ago. And a lot of that, like we've been talking about, comes back to childhood trauma. My trauma took my identity from me. And so when I got on the job at a very young age, which for me was 18, I was handed a badge and an identity. And I'm sure, and this is, I'm going to be interested to hear your perspective on this. When people come in, men or women, come into your practice, or you deal with the systems, what has been your perspective on hearing it, whether they've said, I don't know who I am, but just seeing that you can tell that this person has no identity outside the firehouse or outside of the law enforcement or whatever. What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, I do see that for sure. And I do want to get to talking about females because I think that's an interesting conversation also. I understand it. I understand that need to belong. We all have a need to belong, and being a part of something is actually, and being close, both emotionally close, but also physically close, is the only way we will survive as humans, right? So it's such a strong desire. And what I see is that conflict between this identity that I'm supposed to be, right? This tough firefighter, this tough police officer, and this inside that is, I sometimes say, like, this little teeny tiny boy. I say that to myself. I don't say it to my clients, but this teeny tiny boy who's just hurt and scared and confused. Right. And how do you meld those two together? How can you be both? Right. And there's huge conflict there. And I also see it when people retire.
Yes.
I've had a few pretty young guys retire on medical retirement, and it's interesting to watch their process of letting go of that. And, like they've been firefighters since they were 18, 19, 20. And now people say, oh, what do you do? And they're like, I'm retired firefighter. Oh,
I have no idea.
So young. Yeah. Oh, you're so young.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, some of them are very open about sharing why and how. And I think that that's super healthy. And they are searching for their, like, okay, what do I want to do? And the hard thing, I think, in that is that being in the military or being a first responder, I don't need to tell you this, but there is such a rush associated with the job. And people they know that they don't want to do that anymore, or they can't do that anymore. But there's this search for, like, what else am I going to do? Like, like, that's going to, am I going to work at Lowe's? Like, no.
Nothing else, nothing else measures up at that point when you
Yes.
leave the job. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and purpose also, because when your purpose is saving lives, like really truly saving lives, um, finding something else that gives you a sense of purpose can be really hard. And we talk a lot about, like, especially those younger guys that have retired, who are home now with kids. And I'll remind them, when you were gone for 40 days during the summer, and I was Zooming with you from a hotel in the middle of a inferno, all you wanted was to be home with the kids. And what an amazing gift that you are such a huge part of their lives, and that's a different sense of purpose. But I think that, or whomever, right? Your significant other or your parents, it doesn't have to be kids. But reminding people of that purpose. But I think it is hard in losing that adrenaline rush. And people retire and they're like, oh my God, I just, like, all I'm doing is sleeping. And I'm like, yeah, you've been not sleeping for 30 years. Of course, all you're doing is sleeping. And there's this kind of, you've been climbing up and up and up and up in this fight mode for so long. And there is a drop, and it's scary for people.
It's terrifying.
So,
It's
yeah.
terrifying. And honestly, I like to tell people that I used to create my own chaos when I left the job, because I needed some sort of chaos in my life. And it usually came in the form of some sort of altercation with like my wife or something like that, someone close to me, where I needed something to fill in
Yeah.
that void of no adrenaline, no controversy, no chaos. And it's tough, because you lose that identity and purpose when you transition out of the job, whether it's retirement, medical, injury, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
It's tough.
And I would say also that the like the fighting when you come home, I often remind people that sometimes that's our only way of knowing how to connect in a really intense emotional way. So when you come home and you feel disconnected, and often people describe it like, I feel like I'm like coming into this stranger's household. I don't know where I fit in. I'm not part of the system. I just mess it up if I try to do something, right? And so how do you connect? Well, when you're fighting, you're connected,
It's true. It's
Yeah.
true. When I first got off the job, me and my wife had a hard time sort of communicating at first. And she joked with me one day. She goes, I'm gonna get a couple of walkie-talkies, and that's how we're gonna talk, because you don't talk like this to other people over the radio. So
Yes.
I'm gonna give you a couple of walkie-talkies. That's how we're gonna communicate for a while. We didn't do it, but
Yeah.
it was sort of,
Yeah.
it's true, right?
Yeah. Frequently I'll work with a first responder or a veteran, and we'll work for a long time. And I'll start saying, how about having your significant other come in? And they look at me like, no. And then it's so interesting because they've come so far in their relationship with me, as far as being able to express themselves and share. It's always astounding that they have to almost start at the beginning with their significant other once they're here. I have
Right.
to, like, walk them through, okay, can you share what's going on in your body? Can you share just how it is to be in the room with this person right now?
There is hope. And
Oh,
this is one of the things I always try to express, is that there is hope. And it kind of brings us to another part that I want to talk about. And this is the female first responders and what
yes.
they have to deal with. Now, I grew up in a very, we'll call it chauvinistic, I guess, but very male dominated era with my family and the job. And there weren't a lot of females in the field when I got on. And nowadays, I see it sort of like this. So we have this stigma with mental health that the men themselves are having a hard time being able to admit they have a problem with, because they have their own, level they got to live up to. But then you have
Yeah.
the double-edged sword with females, right? So they're supposed to be more emotional. They're supposed to be whatever society dictates they're supposed to be. But they have this higher than normal expectation on the job. So now, if they admit that they're being affected, or they have
Right.
whatever issues going on, well, then obviously they can't do the job, right?
Right. And it's because they're female.
And it's because they're female.
They don't usually talk about that,
Hmm.
but I can see it.
Right.
Right. I can see it in the way that well, one thing that's so interesting working in such a small county, or town, I should say, is I hear everybody talking about everybody else, so they're constantly, my clients are talking about someone that I see in my practice. They don't know that. Right. So it's so interesting. My relationship with, say, like a female firefighter, and then to hear other men talk about that female firefighter and just how their perspective sometimes is very similar to mine. Of course, I don't work with them, but sometimes it's so different. And I, I, I see that a lot. I see that women feel disregarded, especially communications operators and dispatch. It's less so now, I will say. When I do debriefings, and often the dispatchers are females, not always, there's always a tremendous amount of respect and appreciation shown from the field. And they will say, like, you guys, we could never do our jobs without you.
100%.
And that, yeah. And it's not prompted by me. And it is so important, for dispatchers to hear that. I think for females, it's hard. It's really hard. And I think we need to be sending the same message to them, which is your feelings will help you. It's not, there's no weakness in sharing how you are feeling and what's going on. It actually takes more strength to do that than to shut down and drink your life away. But I hope it's changing. I hear it in the voices of male first responders as they talk about females in a very respectful and equal way, and they, supervisors do struggle with that. I think they struggle with that feeling of, I want to be super supportive of this female on my team, and at the same time, I don't want to treat them any differently because I don't really see them differently, but they are the only female in the house. It's just it's very tricky. And often they'll tell me, and they're great firefighters. They see things and do things and understand what's going on in a way that men don't, just because of our gender differences or, whatever.
It's true.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think things are changing. And I think a lot of that's thanks to some of the females that are out there on the tip of the spear, so to speak, with this topic. And a shout out to Tracy Eldridge, who is a friend of mine who also runs her own podcast and runs her own business, On Scene First. And she actually, her background is being in dispatch. And she was a supervisor out here in my neck of the woods. And she now goes around the country and talks about, dispatcher wellness and focusing on how, dispatchers and telecommunicators are always, the forgotten ones. And her being a female and getting up in front of people and sharing her story is helping to, bridge that gap and break down some of that stigma. And it's huge. It's huge. And I really think it is changing, where females, where they were sort of forced to kind of keep to themselves when it came to, how the job was affecting them when they were, first coming into it, to now where they are in a lot of places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, regarded at the same level as the men.
Yeah. I mean, my clients say to me, I don't know how you do this. And I'm like, I don't know how you do that. Like, it's not for me, but I admire women who can stay true to themselves and still really, physically and emotionally and professionally kick ass when they're out there.
Right. And I think it's, people tend to think that it's women just inherently have an easier time crying, if you will. And I think it's just a social thing. Oh, honestly, men have just been, for generations, have just been, predisposed to not be allowed to.
Yes.
That's really the only reason. I can break down and cry anytime I want, and I do. But because of society in this culture specifically, I had just been so trained and mind warped not to, that I had to start unmind warping myself, and a lot of other men have had to do the same, and it's not that necessarily, I mean, yes, in some genetic level, maybe women are more connected with their emotions, but we're not necessarily more emotional more than the other sex. It's not,
No,
it really isn't.
no. I mean, I have 2 boys and 2 girls of my own, my children,
Hmm.
and my boys are very emotional. And I used to teach child development, and I would teach a lot about this, about attachment theory and letting boys have feelings. And I remember male students would say, but your boys are going to be teased and they're going to be blah, 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 blah. And,
Hmm.
you're doing them a disservice. And I appreciate those comments. I did. And I said, that might be true, but this isn't going to change any other way. And it just turns out that my oldest, who's 19, is a black belt
Hmm.
in Kuksal Do, which is in martial art. He's kind of a skinny, thin, nerdy
Hmm.
artist, and he could kill someone. So, and very emotional and open, which is lovely. And then my youngest, who's 13, also super emotional. And he's 13, he's 6 feet tall. He'll probably be about 6'4", 6'5".
Wow.
And so I love it. I love that I have these strong, very sensitive, emotional boys.
That's the key word,
And
strong.
yeah.
And I think that's a
So
misnomer. And I think that's great. I appreciate you saying that, because as a man, being in touch with your emotions, even a female, being in touch with your emotions doesn't make you less strong. It makes you stronger, because you have more control over that spectrum.
I think it is changing. And sometimes I believe that. And then I, kind of look out into this greater sphere of the world and think like, oh God, maybe it's not. But it
Yeah.
is. I mean, I think it is changing. My son and I were hooked on the show 911. I don't know if you've watched it.
Yeah, my wife
But
watches it.
My husband rolls his eyes. But what I do love about it is that they are showing, the men in that show are very emotional.
Yes.
And it's so important. And it's corny and blah, blah, blah. But it is a great message. It's a great message. And they talk about drugs and alcohol. They talk about PTSD.
Yep.
And I think it is really important. And that tells me that the greater society is more accepting, and at least that information is getting out there, that
Which is huge.
so huge. Yeah.
It really is. And Hollywood has the ability, because people are always binge watching whatever and waiting for the next series. They stand in the ability, in a spot to get that information out there and show that as a society, it is okay to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And to have these shows that are, first responder based, showing that is a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately, I think it is, as people change, as first responders change, as veterans change, and they talk to their friends about their change, and they're accepting of their coworkers who are struggling, and they see it, and they can say, hey, I can see you're struggling. That is where the huge change happens. Most people that come in, I always say, like, what brought you in?
Mm.
And almost always they'll say a few people at work, usually more than 2 people at work, said, hey, something doesn't seem right with you. Are you okay? And when I'm working with people, and sometimes they're off work for a short bit or whatever, but they'll go back to work and they'll say, oh my God, Katy, I can now see everyone around me is struggling, and I will really encourage people to reach out. And they always, not always, but often they'll say, well, I don't really know what to say. And I'm like, pick up your phone right now. Here's the text. Hey, I'm thinking about you.
Yep.
That's it. That's all it has to be. It doesn't have to be, here's a therapist. It doesn't have to be, you seem like things aren't okay. Just that little tiny connection, reaching out and saying, hey, I'm worried about you, or I'm thinking about you. That is where it all starts, I think.
It really is conveying that empathy and that sympathy more frequently. I think, beyond just, what we do for a job and being like, oh, we care for people when we have to go care for people. Let's care for people even when it's not, when we're not on the time clock. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, being seen is pretty important.
Yeah. And honestly, it starts with yourself. And I think we lose, because we're always in that helper mentality. We lose focus on what it really needs to be. And we really need to start with self-love. We really need to care about ourselves. And that's not necessarily in a narcissistic way, but we really need to care for ourselves and love ourselves if we're going to be able to transfer that to the job and ultimately our personal life, especially our spouses and our children.
I think people have a very skewed vision of what therapy is.
Mm,
And I want people to know that, like, this is kind of what therapy is, right? It's just talking about this stuff. It's not,
yep.
I don't do any, I don't do any written assessments. I don't do testing. I don't do any of that shit, because what I know is healing for people is a connection and feeling seen and heard. And it's really just a conversation. It's just a conversation with someone who is not involved in your everyday life and has some insight about, the kind of systems of feelings and how your brain works and trauma in this case and all of it. And I don't think it's as scary usually as people think it's going to be. That's really important for people to understand.
It's a big deal, and that's why I love seeing not just the podcast, but people out there talking more on social media about all of this, all of it, whether it's just the symptoms, or it's the resources, or it's admitting they see a therapist, whatever it is. I think the more and more that people come out about this, and this becomes the normal conversation, much like when the fire service, cancer was like, we never talked about cancer. Oh,
Right.
we don't clean our gear. You had to wear the melted helmet all the time, and the dirtier the gear, the tougher you were. And now it's like, oh, well,
Yeah.
that shit gives you cancer.
Right.
And now we clean our gear, and now we talk about cancer, and now we get pre-screenings, and we go and see our doctor and stuff. This, I think, is the path that mental health is sort of on, where
Yeah.
we're starting to get to that more normal conversation where the people are like, oh, wait a minute, you said you're scared of something, or you have PTSD. Oh, sorry, don't talk about that. We're now starting to be like, hey, tell me a little bit more about that. I don't know a lot about that. And that's huge. That's I think a big change in the breakdown of the stigma.
Yeah. I mean, my dream is that there's training around wellness every week in the fire station and at the PD in the, office,
Mm-hmm.
just like there is about cleaning your gear and breathing apparatus and all those things, because once it's really embedded and it just becomes this like training that we do every week, that I think is when it's going to, then when people aren't having to seek it, right? It's just there. I think that's really important. And we did that for a while after the campfire, and it was so successful. It was so interesting for me, because I would walk into a station and just kind of sit down to shoot the shit with people, and pretty soon, more people are in the doorway. Someone's now in the kitchen. The young guys are coming in from cleaning the trucks. Like,
Yep.
okay, now, an hour later, everybody's sitting there having this conversation, because it's important, and it has to sort of happen organically. I don't think holding a big training, that you can show up to or not, you know, I don't think that works as well as that sort of like informal, this is what we talk about all the time. It's just it's same with suicide. Like, the more we talk about suicide, the less stigma, and the more it just becomes a conversation, and a person is able to say, hey, I'm feeling suicidal, instead of it being this huge secret. So that's a whole other ball of wax, but sort of.
Right, and the hope is here that proactive resiliency sort of becomes a thing, where we're not waiting for crisis to happen to start getting people back to healing. That we're healing from the get-go, so this doesn't become strange territory, and people have this as a skill set, much like you have your firefighting or your law enforcement skills. You have your mental health skills, and I think it can lead to such great things.
I think it's so great that you are doing this podcast, and that you're being vulnerable and willing to talk about your own experience. And it's such a great way of normalizing the conversation. Yeah, just taking away that stigma that something is wrong with someone because
Right.
they're struggling, So,
well, I'm not the only one out there doing it. I appreciate that. And that's why we do it. We want people not to have to go through what we did for such a long time. And there's no reason why anyone should.
and I will say that just quickly, that is one thing that I have seen that has changed also, is that I'm getting more and more clients in their 20s who are getting it, like, oh, I got to start clearing this shit out as it's happening, because they're working with 40, 45-year-olds who they see are so overwhelmed and so shut down and so unable to deal with their emotions. And so that's great. That is, friends say, oh, my son or daughter is thinking about being a firefighter. What do you think? And I'll say, well, I think they should use every single one of their EAP sessions from the moment they start, just
Mhm.
as get that stuff out, and process it and process it and process it so it doesn't build up.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's just building that skill set and getting familiar with unfamiliar territory for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, awesome. Katy, this has been an amazing discussion and a great perspective for those listening and watching to hear a clinician sort of give their end of things. Thank you for coming on today.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's been great for me too. Appreciate it.
Awesome, folks. I will put the Katy's information in the show notes for you to reach out to her and check out her stuff for sure. And stay tuned for future episodes here on the Resilient Responder podcast. And as always, stay safe and stay healthy. Much love.